Welcome to my workshop on infrared digital photography. The image on this slide was taken about 30 years ago using traditional 35mm infrared film. It is printed on Ilford sepia matte paper. This image is a good place to start as it shows the detail and flow of foliage into creamy whites that was possible with traditional film infrared techniques. But with the emergence of digital photography, infrared imaging is becoming a more flexible endeavor with the ability to easily produce images of stunning quality. So today I'm going to discuss how to use your digital camera to produce a variety of infrared images. We're going to get into a variety of topics during this presentation, starting with a little science that helps to explain how the electromagnetic spectrum works and its role in infrared photography. From there, I will go into how infrared radiation is detected, surfaces that reflect infrared radiation, pre-digital processes and limitations imposed by traditional film technologies, and contrast this to opportunities available with digital cameras. I will also discuss ways in which your digital camera can be modified to add even more flexibility to shooting in infrared. I will also cover lens filters and lens hotspots with certain types of camera lenses and how to overcome those issues. A fair amount of time will be spent in the digital darkroom discussing how to manipulate photos taken in infrared to give them a good infrared look and feel. Finally, I'll give you some web-based resources so that you can continue to explore infrared digital photography along with a number of other examples that will emphasize different techniques that can be employed to achieve a variety of desired effects. The image on this screen is of a pumpkin vine, an immature pumpkin, taken with a full spectrum converted camera and a Sigma 105mm macro lens. Macro photography can present new opportunities when shooting in infrared, and that will be discussed too during the course of the presentation. Without getting into a lot of detail, the electromagnetic spectrum consists of two components, the electric and the magnetic. The light that we see reflected off of any surface is electromagnetic energy from electromagnetic waves of various wavelengths. Our eyes can detect only a small bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation within the wavelengths of about 400 to 750 nanometers. Below that wavelength, as the wave oscillations get shorter and shorter, we have ultraviolet energy, X-rays, and gamma rays. As wavelengths get longer, we have infrared light, microwaves, and then radio waves. Mechanical devices like digital cameras can easily detect electromagnetic waves outside of the visible light bandwidth, and all digital cameras contain filters over their sensors that are called hot mirrors to keep infrared and ultraviolet radiation from polluting our images with unwanted radiation. But when these hot filters are bypassed, interesting possibilities for unusual photography can be discovered. Before going too far into the presentation, I want to jump ahead a bit and remind everyone that camera filters are rarely absolute devices. In the area of infrared photography, small differences in filter types put on cameras can make big changes in the wavelengths of light passed onto the camera sensor. For instance, a filter that is close to the blue area of the visible light wavelength will pass a lot of blue and allow you to make skies a pleasing blue while retaining white and some color in foliage, while a filter closer to the upper end of the visible light spectrum will tend to turn a sky deep black and foliage very white. In between the filter extremes is where a lot of fun can happen by selectively allowing the digital camera to detect colors to varying degrees, resulting in unusual color combinations and tonalities in the final image. We'll come back to this idea later, just please keep it in mind for now. Infrared radiation has a lot of various applications when it comes to imaging. In addition to general photography, Infrared is routinely used in a variety of forensic and crime scene evidence collection photography. Infrared is also widely used in astrophotography. If you have ever had severe muscle pain, your doctor may have prescribed infrared heat therapy. In our digital world, appliances such as computers, TVs, and just about anything that has a remote controller associated with it relies on beams of infrared light. Infrared imaging is also used extensively in laboratories and industry to help detect where components of various machines may be failing. The image on this page is an infrared of a transformer that shows where the transformer is overloading and producing excessive heat that will ultimately lead to component failure in the device in which it is being used. When it comes to digital cameras, a bluish piece of glass called a hot mirror is layered on top of the camera's digital sensor that detects electromagnetic radiation bouncing off whatever subject is being photographed. The purpose of this hot mirror is to keep infrared and ultraviolet radiation from polluting the image sensor. This hot mirror can be easily removed and replaced by other filters that allow infrared light to pass through the camera sensor. By replacing the hot mirror with filters that allow various wavelengths of infrared radiation to get to the camera sensor at different intensity levels, unusual and interesting images can be produced. For the photographer, there are a variety of ways to capture infrared radiation and use it to make images. Traditionally, photographers used infrared film for this purpose, and a few manufacturers produce it in limited quantities today. However, this film tends to be quite expensive, and unlike digital cameras, a bad image cannot be immediately viewed and deleted if it is not what is expected. So digital photography makes infrared imaging quite affordable with the proper selection of filtration devices to replace the hot mirror that is currently in your camera. Before getting into how infrared images are made with a digital camera, let's look at the surfaces that tend to make interesting infrared images. As a rule, anything with green foliage is going to reflect infrared light, so a lot of infrared photography features nature and plant-based scenes. The images on this slide are taken from the abandoned train tracks just outside of Saluda, North Carolina, and an emerging lily in my flower garden. But that doesn't mean the plant has to be green to get a good infrared image. Any plants containing chlorophyll will also reflect infrared radiation. An example given here is an emerging Japanese maple leaf that was very dark red. Because it contains chlorophyll, it reflects infrared radiation and helped to produce this final image. The lens chosen for this shot was the Lens Baby Soft Focus 2, and that helps accentuate the tonality blend and overall softness of the shot. Shiny metallic objects present a lot of opportunities and challenges in infrared photography. Some metal objects will reflect infrared light, while others don't. One just has to experiment with subject matter. Usually, infrared light on metal objects will be concentrated in the specular highlights coming off the image. So this is where I focus in producing metal object infrared images. By using a zone plate setting in the Lens Baby Obscura pinhole, I was able to generate unusual sun and radiation ray patterns in these silver chalices. We often tend to think of infrared as a plant-only photographic endeavor. However, pets that have a light coat often tend to be reflective of infrared radiation. My dog has a ginger-colored coat that does a nice job of reflecting infrared radiation, and light-colored animals are a worthy subject for infrared photography. Don't forget people either. Human skin has an unusual quality that both reflects and absorbs infrared light. The results can be quite different depending on the amount of infrared light hitting the subject. This picture is a self-portrait using an infrared converted camera while sitting in my shower. Because photographs of people are so dependent on the amount of light hitting the subject, people photos can take on a really spooky feel with a variety of subtle colors. This is a self-portrait at f/45 using a zone plate setting on the Lens Baby Obscura lens. The lens was planned for this photograph to produce a variety of red and blue hues in the final image as a consequence of the way in which the zone plate allows light of various frequencies to hit the sensor in different areas of the image. With infrared, it is fun to sometimes just play around to see what happens. This extended time exposure from within a vehicle really gives a sense of motion into a surreal environment. A word of caution though, don't attempt this while driving as it's easy to get very distracted in the process. Clouds on sunny days, especially when cross-lit, can make really dramatic images with great highlight and shadow detail. Expose for the highlights when shooting clouds to avoid burnouts in the final image. A lot of people tend to think of infrared photography as a sunny day only activity. This may have been true with traditional film infrared photography, but digital infrared offers a whole range of new possibilities on overcast and rainy days. Remember from an earlier slide that filtration is not an absolute with infrared photography filters? Well, the same is true when no filter is used at all, and varying infrared intensity situations can produce a wide variety of results in the same scene. This image was taken just as a storm was hitting in my area early in the morning. The clouds over the sun were still letting some IR light through, and by complementing the soft IR light with a Lens Baby Soft Focus 2 lens, I was able to get this shot of trees in various stages of blooming with mountains and thick clouds as the backdrop. An hour later, the storm had really hit its peak, and the amount of available infrared light had dropped off dramatically. So the same shot tended to underexpose the highlights on the trees, turning the foliage various shades of red. By evening, the storm had passed, the sun was back out, and a lot of infrared radiation was once again bathing the scene. The only camera setting I changed from earlier in the day was that I tightened the aperture to f4 to reduce the soft focus feel of the image. So I think this series of last 3 slides shows pretty well that when shooting digital, that infrared is not just a sunny day proposition. Another advantage of digital infrared photography is ease of preparation and processing. Those who engaged in film-based infrared photography will remember changing bags and the need to load and process film in total darkness. Even the traditional red darkroom light was of no use in making things easier, as it is a good emitter of infrared radiation that will quickly destroy unexposed infrared film. So if you could not see well with your hands in total darkness, traditional IR photography with film was almost impossible. With digital imaging, we are certainly living in the golden age of infrared photography, as we don't have any of these hassles now. Once again, remember how we talked about filters not being absolute when it comes to blocking specific wavelengths of light? This creates possibilities for infrared photography even without removal or replacement of the camera hot mirror. To test to see if your camera can detect infrared radiation, put it on a tripod in a darkened room and set the timer for 15 to 30 second exposure. Then aim a TV remote at the camera and press the TV on button for 5 to 10 seconds. If the camera can detect infrared radiation, you will be able to see the TV remote IR beam on the image. If the hot mirror has not been removed from your camera, making IR images means long exposure times in the range of 15 to 30 seconds, a fair amount of sunshine, an external filter like a +4 neutral density filter, a tripod, and a lot of patience and trial and error, because in post-processing you will likely find unwanted color casts and hotspots in your image. But these limitations can also be used to your advantage in making IR images. Here is an example of what an IR image looks like before and after processing when the hot mirror is still installed in the camera. Images taken with long exposures present the usual challenges introduced by things like wind and focus issues and lots of time in post-processing. There's got to be a better way of doing IR photography. And that better way is to take a digital camera and have it modified for dedicated infrared photography. It's a great way to breathe new life into an old digital camera. But before sending your camera off for modification, it is important to decide what types of infrared images you want to make. There are a lot of options for both black and white images, lots of color, and in-between effects. The camera hot mirror can be replaced with no mirror or a variety of infrared filters that allow only specific wavelengths within the infrared band to get to the camera's sensor. A full spectrum conversion allows pretty much the entire IR spectrum from 530 to 830 nanometers to be passed to the camera sensor, while a partial spectrum conversion allows you to select a filter to replace the hot mirror for the type of selective color infrared images that you want to produce. Before sending your camera off for infrared conversion, I recommend going to lifepixel.com and reviewing their information on how your camera will respond to various replacement filters for the hot mirror. As you can see from this and the next several slides, the examples at LifePixel will help you decide on the type of replacement filter you need. As you can see in comparing this slide to the previous one, as the filtration spectrum number is reduced in the replacement filter, the colors that can be produced in post-processing tend to become more vivid. These effects can be complemented by various types of lens filters as well. Again, as the filtration number continues to come down, color saturation increases. The other thing that this series of charts points out is that the automatic white balance in your camera must be turned off before taking infrared images. Automatic white balancing logic assumes you are trying to take a color image and it is guaranteed to ruin an infrared shot. The procedure that should be repeated at every IR shooting session is to turn automatic white balance off and create a custom setting for white balance. Then, before you shoot a scene, find some green grass or trees in the scene that are neither in direct highlighted light or deep shadows, and use that to reset the white balance for the entire scene. This procedure can be repeated as many times as necessary throughout a shooting session and will help ensure correct IR exposure that minimizes highlight blowouts, which we'll talk more about later. Don't skimp on this process. Do custom white balancing in your camera at the beginning of every infrared photo session at the very least. On my camera, I had the full spectrum conversion done, and personally, that is what I recommend, as full spectrum conversion gives the greatest flexibility, as lens filters can be added back into the mix to gain many of the results that are enhanced with use of specific filters to replace the hot mirror. Complete information on filtration options and the effect they have on infrared images can be found on both the LifePixel and Kalari Vision websites. My personal favorite filter for infrared photography is the Foca 6-in-1 IR filter. This filter allows you to simply dial in the spectrum of IR filtration you want at any given time, so it replaces the need to carry around a lot of separate IR filters. The filters are available on Amazon, but be forewarned, some shipping delays can occur as they are not always available locally in any given country. We talked a bit about filters on previous slides, and it's worth the time to understand all of the available options in IR photography filtration. Blue and red filters with filtration at various wavelengths will control the color transmission to your image, and neutral density filters will allow management of very bright situations when using an unconverted camera. We discussed the variable IR filters previously. You can also buy a hot mirror filter to sit on top of your lens to convert your camera back into a color camera if you desire, although I've found this filter to result in muting of color vibrance in images. Also, you may already have many filters in your current gear such as red, green, and blue that can be incorporated into your digital image production strategies. Once you have taken the jump into digital infrared photography, one of the problems you may encounter will be undesirable hotspots in your images. There are a variety of causes and cures for these hotspots that can ruin otherwise good infrared photographs. Hotspots are largely a function of aperture settings on the lenses. As a lens is stopped down, it is more likely to exhibit hotspot problems. But this is not true of all lenses, as there are a number of lenses that exhibit no hotspot problems at all, regardless of aperture setting. One of the biggest lens categories that produces hotspots is zoom lenses. They are more prone to hotspots at different focal lengths due to internal designs that sometimes concentrate IR light on the camera sensor. This is usually related to internal anti-reflective coatings. The odd thing is that identical zoom lens focal lengths in offerings from different manufacturers can have their hotspots at widely different focal length settings. Also, as a general rule, whenever a variable zoom has a macro setting, the macro setting will almost always have a hotspot problem in infrared photography. The solution to hotspots are first to test your zoom lenses you plan on using against a gray card to determine which focal lengths to avoid when shooting infrared, and use prime lenses as much as possible, although some prime lenses also have problems with hotspots. If you're going to do macro infrared photography, my recommendation is to use a dedicated macro lens to avoid hotspot issues. All macro photos taken and shown in this presentation were done with a Sigma 105mm lens, and I have never had hotspot issues with this lens, regardless of aperture setting. There are also several non-lens considerations in minimizing hotspots. The lens angle relative to the infrared light source can often produce hotspots that can be eliminated by simply repositioning the shot. And too much light in a scene can produce hotspots that may be curable with a neutral density filter. All this information on hotspots sounds like it may be a deal breaker in getting into infrared photography, but that's not the case. Kalari Vision has done the infrared photography community a great service by creating a lens hotspot database that includes a hotspot analysis of every type of lens you can think of. It is constantly being updated as new lenses come onto the market. So before buying a new lens, I highly encourage you to consult this database if you're looking for a lens that will be used for infrared imaging. Another important thing to remember is that the infrared spectrum of light is different and a little bit longer in wavelength than the visible light spectrum, and this means that focusing of the camera for infrared images will be a bit different. In an unconverted camera, a focused image for color will likely result in an out-of-focus infrared image. If you're shooting with an older lens, the red focal length lines and numbers on the lens barrels are used to refocus the image for infrared prior to taking the shot. So the procedure is to focus the image for color, read the setting on the color focal distance scale on the lens barrel, and then readjust for correct IR focal length before taking the shot. Or if you have a newer lens, just take the shot at a slightly different focal lengths and keep the one that ends up being in focus. The best solution, however, in a converted camera is to get the focal length of your converted camera calibrated for infrared and dedicate the camera to shooting IR. If you're ready to take the jump into infrared digital photography and want to get a camera converted to IR, The two main companies that provide this service are Vision and LifePixel. Both do full and partial spectrum conversions along with recalibration of focusing. They also sell both new and used cameras that they have converted to infrared in their shops. The cost for conversion varies from $99 to $500 depending on type of camera. However, most common 35mm digital cameras fall in the range of $175 to $275. When you consider how much IR film costs these days and that digital cameras have no real exposure frame limits, that's a real true bargain. Both companies also sponsor a variety of workshops and tutorial services. One word of caution though. To me, it looks like these companies have had some prior experience in digital printer technologies. You know, buy the printer at a very reasonable price, then pay for it with frequent purchases of ink. These companies also sell their own line of filters, and the prices seem to be between 2 to 3 times the price of a nearly identical filter purchased from other sources. So my recommendation is to shop around before investing money in a collection of infrared filters. Now let's talk about the age-old problem in infrared photography, highlight blowouts, and how to minimize them in both pre- and post-processing. I put up this image because it is sometimes what I feel an infrared image will look like with just the slightest overexposure in highlights. It's an exaggeration for sure, but the first exposure rule in IR digital work is to expose so that highlights are not going to get blown out, or at least try to get close, as there are some post-processing remedies that can be used. Here is an example of a photograph I took with the Lensbaby Soft Focus 2. The original on the left was almost what I wanted, but it was ruined by the highlight blowout in the stem of the mushroom. But because I had exposed for this highlight, the blowout was not so severe that it could not be corrected in post-processing. Burning the area is an option, but I try to avoid burning as it often produces a muddied area in the image. The better solution is slight adjustment of the highlights in the Curves tool that slightly decreases exposure in the highlights. In this example, I had just enough information in the blowout areas that the Curves tool allowed me to bring back just enough definition in the highlights to result in a good image. Experiment with the often overlooked Curves tool, but keep in mind, small changes in the curves will greatly alter the image. Go slow with changes and make them very carefully. And now let's talk about what to do in post-processing to achieve your infrared photography vision. Again, this image is of my ginger-colored dog with no infrared filter and use of the Lensbaby Suite 35 to focus the viewer on his cute little face. The first thing to remember in both pre- and post-processing is that white balance must be properly adjusted for digital infrared photography to work. In your camera, before ever taking your first infrared image, turn the automatic white balance feature off and establish the custom white balance that we previously covered. If you miss the white balance setting by a lot and get highlight blowouts, they cannot be corrected in post-processing. But if you miss optimal white balance settings by just a little, as was seen on the previous mushroom image example, the white balance can usually be corrected with the use of Curves tool available in many post-processing software packages. Assuming white balance is close to ideal before the picture is taken, here is what I do in post-processing to achieve an image similar to the above when no filter is used in a full spectrum IR converted camera. First, I use auto tone and possibly auto color in Photoshop, followed by any correction for overexposure in the highlights that I think is needed. Then I do a channel swap of the red and blue channels. We'll go over this at great detail in a few minutes as this is core to digital infrared photography. After swapping channels, I will do further contrast and tone adjustments. Lastly, when using no filters, I'll bring out selective color, hue, saturation, and vibrance with the color adjustment tool. I will also denoise the image as a final step. In the case of this image, it was taken with no filter using a Lens Baby Velvet 76, which allowed for a lot of detail on the berries that blended into the softness of the green leaves that turned white in highlights and pale red in the shadows. Okay, now for how to do the channel swapping. The image on this slide is what a typical infrared image will look like before final processing in Photoshop. Although it looks quite drab right now, I'm going to show you how to do channel swapping step by step to make it begin to pop with that infrared look. As a reminder, if the image is a deep magenta and pink, that means that the auto feature of the white balance in your camera is probably turned on. The image in this slide is what a fairly well-balanced image should look like before post-processing. The first thing you want to do is tone, contrast, and add the automatic color adjustments to the image. Notice how this popped things up a bit. Then find out where the channel mixer tool is located in your post-processing software. In the case of Photoshop, it is under Adjustments and the subfolder Channel Mixer. This is where we will swap the red and blue channels. So let's open the Channel Mixer. When you get to the Channel Mixer, you will see a couple of things. The first is the output channel. It should default to red in most programs, and under the drop-down menu are the green and blue channel selections. For infrared, all that needs to be changed is the red and the blue channels. Starting with the red channel, the first thing to do is move the red slider bar from 100% to 0%. Notice how this has taken all of the red and red-hued color out of the photograph. Staying in the red channel, now move the blue slider bar from 0% to 100%. This action of making the red 0 and the blue 100 is called channel swapping the red channel for the blue channel. After the red channel has been swapped, go to the Output Channel drop-down, which in Photoshop is above the sliders, and select the blue channel. Once in the blue channel, do the exact opposite of what was done in the red channel. First, move the blue slider from 100% to 0%. Then finally, while still on the blue channel, move the red slider from 0% to 100%. This is what is called channel swapping the blue channel. So functionally, what we have done is exchanged the reds for the blues and the blues for the reds in the image, which is collectively called channel swapping. Note how this has resulted in the foliage becoming shades of white and the sky becoming blue. From this point, further enhancements to the image can be made by adjustments that you are probably already familiar with, like hue and saturation, levels, and other tools as necessary to improve the image. On this slide, I show what I started out with and what happened after channel swapping, followed by other adjustments commonly employed to improve color photographs. One word of caution though, it seems as though several of the different photo processing software packages use different algorithms in channel swapping. Some may look better than others to your eye, so some experimenting with different software packages may be necessary to get the results you're looking for in infrared photography. Also, it's worth mentioning that you may not want to create a macro to automatically perform the toning, color, and channel swapping activities as a single one-stroke batch process. By doing each step individually, you may sometimes find that an intermediate step without completing the whole process of channel swapping yields a more interesting result than the complete channel swapping process. When I created this image, I took the photograph twice to show the extremes of filter settings. A filter at approximately 500 nanometers results in blues in the sky, while a filter in the 700 nanometer range eliminates the blues. Had I gone up to 750 nanometers in the second exposure, the sky would have been almost pure black with very slight white clouds. There is another alternative process for producing infrared photographs that tend to turn leaves and other foliage gold instead of white. The process will give very good control over final tonality of the image. It involves turning raw images into DNG or digital negative files, which were popular in the early days of digital photography. To make a DNG infrared image, you will need to obtain a free copy of Adobe's DNG Profile Editor and create a DNG infrared profile that you can use over and over again to convert raw images into the DNG format. Next, load the DNG image into Camera Raw, which is part of your image editing software if using Adobe products. Apply the DNG profile and adjust the white balance to taste. From there, you can take the image into your photo editing software and process the image as required. The Kalari Vision website has extensive information on how to do this with links to the needed software downloads, so go there for complete details on this alternative editing process. One of the allures of infrared photography is what I call the cotton candy effect, where highlights seem to flow into areas of creamy whites. This was an effect common to traditional film infrared photography. The Photoshop Filter Gallery's Glow tool can be used to simulate this effect in digital infrared images. In some software packages, adjusting the haze will produce similar results. As with the Curves tool, adjustments with the Glow tool should be made very sparingly to avoid excessive detail blowout in the highlights. I added this slide to the presentation because several individuals in my local camera club use Adobe Photoshop Elements as their post-processing software. Unfortunately, Photoshop Elements does not have the channel mixer function to swap channels, so I did some comparisons and discovered that Photoshop Elements is very similar in look and feel to Photoshop 6, which was released right about the time that Adobe started to promote their online software offerings. In my opinion, Photoshop Elements is little different than Photoshop 6, with a number of the features, including the channel mixer, being just turned off. If you use Photoshop Elements, you can unlock the channel mixer feature by going to elementsplus.net, and for $12 you can reactivate the channel mixer feature along with a host of other features that have been supposedly deleted from the Photoshop Elements product. Now let's look at some sample images. These are all my creations, and in some cases I do not consider them to be my best work. Each image has been chosen not because it's a good image, but because it contains some effect that is possible with a variety of different camera settings and post-processing manipulations. This is one of the last images I took with an unconverted Nikon D7500 SLR with a neutral density filter and an exposure time of about 10 seconds. It was a windy day, and the movement the wind created in the trees and grass helped, in this instance, to create that creamy infrared exposure look that appeals to a lot of people. This image was taken with an 8mm fisheye, and it's a picture of kudzu at 520 nanometers. If you live in an area that has this invasive plant, don't hesitate to photograph it in infrared. Kudzu is one of the best infrared reflective plants that I have ever found. This isn't one of my favorite images due to the foliage highlight to the left of the bridge, but it does show very well what is possible with an in-between setting on IR filters. In this case, I use 650 nanometers. Notice how the horizon, which is rich in infrared, fades as one moves up into the sky. This effect occurs in this image for several reasons. First, because as one moves away from the Earth up into the sky, reflected infrared declines. Second, the middle setting was blocking just enough of the blues at the higher elevations so that the transition from light horizon to black sky became much more accentuated. So this slide shows the value of experimentation with slight changes in filter settings to gain an entirely different feel in the final image. This image was taken at 550 nanometers through a crystal ball. The crystal ball resulted in a light image against a sky background that contained little infrared outside of the ball. Crystal balls can be a fun accessory in infrared photography, producing very unusual results. Here is a picture of yellow apples shot at 720 nanometers. It was not converted to black and white, just channel swapped. Otherwise, the image is just as it appeared in pre-processing. Clouds are a favorite subject of mine with infrared photography. By exposing for the highlights at the center of the image, the outer edges of the image became underexposed, resulting in reds and gray mixes. Because it was taken with a Lens Baby Sweet lens, the center is focused while the outer portions of the photograph blur. It gives a real sense of movement up into the cloud cover. However, I find the value of an image like this is as a background for composite images. One day while visiting an antique store, I came upon this gas mask and immediately remembered the cloud image on the previous slide. By layering the clouds on the gas mask, along with some selective clearing, this image was made possible. Because infrared photography at 700 nanometers and above can produce pitch black skies, remember to look up during the daytime. The only things in the sky that are going to produce whites against this black backdrop are clouds and the moon. And at the high filtration settings, this combination can result in some unusual infrared photographs. When shooting without a filter on a full spectrum converted camera, it becomes possible to selectively bring colors back into a photograph with the color adjustments tool available in photo processing software packages. This shot of a tomato flower is a good example of selectively bringing up the saturation of red and yellow with a shallow depth of field on a dark background. And don't forget to just experiment. This is a single shot from the deck on my house. By manipulating a large glass prism in front of the lens and shooting without an infrared filter, I was able to capture a lot of bizarrely juxtapositioned details in a single infrared photograph. This was a shot taken at a 4th of July parade in my hometown. It's the combination of lens choice as well as infrared settings that made this look like an old early 1900s postcard that added the illusion of motion to the final image. The lens was the Lens Baby Sweet 35 with a 650 nanometer IR filter. A detail that I find particularly interesting is the man sitting on the bench on the other side of the street. Can you see how the car windshield brought him into focus? This is a picture of some pine trees at 650 nanometers. The original picture was fairly dull as I underexposed it. In this case, a +3 glow enhancement with a +15 clearing of the glow brought it back to life, especially on the interplay between light and shadows on the ground. Here is another shot where the infrared effect and lens choice complement one another to get that soft cotton candy feel of a traditional infrared photograph. Notice how the pine needles have been turned soft whites and grays by the filter setting and contrasted against the tree trunks and background. The effect was further enhanced by use of a Lens Baby Soft Focus 2 at f4.0 to add just a bit more flow in the pine needles during a still day. Here is another example of how colors can be selectively enhanced in infrared macro photography to highlight certain parts of the image, in this case the center of the flower. In addition to increasing the saturation and vibrance in one selected color, it is possible to purposely bring up saturation, hue, and vibrance of the entire color spectrum passed by the filter. The results can be a very different photograph. Here is another example of a macro infrared photograph taken at a very high filter setting. Because I was just dealing with a variety of green shades behind a dark backdrop, this became a subject that was just screaming for black and white infrared application. In all of my photographic endeavors, I have had very few photographs come out just the way I wanted them to. This image resulted from matching the infrared filtration to the right lens. The subject is common rush, a weed that grows in a ditch beside my house. I was shooting for a small area of detail on one reed while maintaining a sense of depth as the reeds receded into the background. To keep the focus on the reed with the tip, I chose the Lens Baby Velvet 56. This kept the reed in focus while everything away from it toward the sides of the image melted into the background darkness. The combination of the 750 nanometer filtration and f2.8 setting on the velvet lens produced exactly what I had in mind. Here we have another 750 nanometer fun shot. This one was simply a shot into the clouds through several crystal balls that both distorted and clarified the clouds. Doesn't it look like a spine and head X-ray of an alien? Here is a good example of why I do channel swapping without assistance from a batch processing macro. I got halfway through the initial post-processing for channel swapping and saw something unusual. A golden reflection coming off the running water and a color imparted to the rocks that didn't look blah. So I stopped before completing the channel swapping and punched the reds and yellows up a bit for this unusual effect with a fisheye lens. Again, this is an example of marrying the right filter selection, in this case no filter, in a full spectrum converted camera to a soft focus lens. By exposing for the highlights, I ended up with some nice red hues in this image and a good interplay between shadows and highlights throughout. The result of this match of lens to filtration choice resulted in a very painterly image. This is an image of an old car that has been parked in one spot for quite a few years. I love to do infrared shots like this where there's an open background. If you have in your lens collection a red lens and cyan lens, put the red lens over your left eye and the cyan lens over your right eye for the next two slides. This is what is called an anaglyph or three-dimensional photograph. There are a number of ways to convert images into anaglyphs, and most of the software is available on the web for free. In this case, I made the car pop forward in the frame while receding the background. Again, you have to have a red lens over your left eye and a cyan lens over your right eye to see this image in 3D. And in this case, I receded everything into the background with selective recession into the background in the parts of the image surrounding the car. The anaglyphs have really very little to do with infrared photography, but I find them interesting and thought you might find them unusual as well. There are a lot of good resources on the internet for anyone from beginner to experienced in infrared photography. LifePixel and KalariVision are both websites with quite a bit of information on the subject, and these two businesses are the leaders in mirrorless digital camera infrared conversions. The Facebook groups on infrared photography are good places to visit as well to see some of the creativity that is happening in infrared photography. Adobe has a very good introduction to the subject, and both photofocus.com and shutterstock.com have tutorials geared primarily to those who are just starting their journey into this fascinating and rewarding aspect of photography. Well, that ends the slides for now. Thanks for listening. I hope you found something in the slides that you can incorporate into your own infrared photography experience. Thanks again, and have a good day.